Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I'm joined by Gary Allen. Gary is a manager with over 40 years work experience in the energy sector, but he actually started his career off as an electronics bench technician, similar to me actually. Gary, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Well, sure. I'm Gary Allen, and that is correct. I started off as a bench technician in 1986. In fact, it was June 6th, 1986. So, wow, that's a long time. So here we are, and I started off as a bench technician. I did that for about 7 years, and then I moved into tech support for the technical products we made, which were biomedical test and measurement. And I did tech support for 2.5 years. Then I moved into engineering as a verification and validation engineer. And I did that in 2 stints with an MIS job in between. So that's about 5 years of that, give or take. And then the company got bought, and we got bought by Fluke Corporation of all companies, because they wanted to add biomedical test and measurement to themselves. So very few of us actually remained, and I remained because I was doing the verification and validation work, and they didn't have anybody who had FDA experience, because we made biomedical test and measurement. We had class 1 and class 2 medical devices in the product line. So that was interesting. The move was interesting. I stayed with the Biomed group for, I left that, it was late 2005, so about 3 years, 3.5. And then I moved into the product compliance group, which at the time was known as product evaluation, because we did more than just regulatory compliance. So that became high energy products and that sort of thing for measurement, test and measurement, multimeters, power quality analyzers, a ton of things like that. So I had to get pretty smart on distribution, power distribution, line distribution, various things like that. We weren't going up into the medium or high voltage ranges. Everything that we made was down in low voltage, which basically has a threshold of 1,000 volts. So anything above 1,000 volts became medium voltage, and anything above 38.4, I believe, became high voltage. So it's been a while since I've thought about those numbers, but I think it's 38.4. Anyway, so I did that for 11 years. And in the process of doing that, I was writing reports, safety and, other reports, but mostly safety. And we had an agreement with CSA. It was very similar to UL. That's the Canadian Safety Group. And they had a memorandum of understanding with UL. So we got UL and CSA by doing the CSA reports. But we were on their highest data acceptance program, and we were allowed to write our own reports and submit them. There would be a little bit of back and forth almost always, because the products are complicated. And then they would sign off on those, and we had our CSA mark. That's a very complicated process that I've just simplified into a few sentences, but getting a product through CSA on the IEC 61010 series of standards is not trivial. It can take anywhere from an absolute minimum of 2 weeks to somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 months of back and forth, because testing and writing reports and finding flaws and getting things fixed and then retesting and all that is arduous. And then, of course, you have to write lab reports effectively for every clause that applies in the standard. So there's a separate lab report for the tests that are done based on the requirements of the standard for those clauses. And that led me into, let's see, I was laid off in 2019, late 2019. That led me to Meta. And at Meta, I was in effectively the product research group. It was, at the time, it was called Facebook Reality Labs. And then it became Meta Reality Labs, and then just Reality Labs. So Reality Labs research, it was all the hardware research for gaming devices and other technologies that they were working on that had a hardware component to them. That included everything from Oculus and a few other things they delved into. So I was doing laser safety for them because I got a little bit of laser exposure, 2.5, 3 years, something like that at Fluke. We bought a little company that made laser level measurements. So they were laser levels effectively. They'd draw a line across a surface, or two lines if you had both the Y and X axis lasers turned on. And so that was an interesting thing. And they were fairly low power lasers. They were class 2 effectively, which gave you an opportunity to look away if you got it in your eyes. You have about a quarter second of response time. It's so bright that you basically have to look away. It hurts. If you left it on your retina for a long period of time, it would damage it. But the quarter second response time was well within tolerance for safety. So anyway, moving to Meta, I went all the way up from class 2 to class 4 lasers, some of them in terms of watts rather than microwatts or milliwatts of optical power. And then we had extremely bright LEDs, none of which could be seen by the human eye because they were outside of the visible spectrum. They were in the infrared, the near infrared spectrum. And those were for everything from imaging to, I think we started in face recognition and then backed out of it. We didn't do that because of liability. And then there was, Apple does it with their phones. They recognize your face and you can log in. And Windows does it with various laptops and things that have decent cameras. That's all infrared technology, and it is fairly bright. We didn't actually shine any class 4 or high power light into anyone's eyes because it was going through an optical stack and basically reduced. The optical stack did all kinds of things, including allow scanning by splitting the beam into a whole bunch of smaller beams effectively. But we reduced the power down to a safe level. And there was a tremendous amount of emphasis for various work groups on maintaining safety. We basically wouldn't allow them to advance any research project into further development without going through safety and actually walking through their entire process. They had to give us a theory of operation and, a number of things like that. So that was how I ended up doing laser safety. That lasted 3 years. And then I was off into being a manager. So that's the bulk of my experience in a few minutes.
Okay. No, that sounds amazing, actually. So was it always your plan to become a manager? Because going from a technician to climb the career ladder to a manager it's actually quite an amazing achievement. I've done the same myself. I started off as a technician, actually an electronics technician as well. And it is quite hard to climb the ladder. What has been one of your key aspects of advice that you can give our younger audiences?
Okay, if you want to climb that ladder faster, you basically need to focus on becoming a manager And that means that you're looking at all of the responsibilities that a manager has. And in my case, it's a manager of a technical group that does basically services the product development and research and various other things for the entire company. Now, it's not a big company and it's in the railroad industry, so it was a huge switch for me. I didn't have any railroad safety background or anything else. And so that was an interesting thing. But if you want to do it faster than I did, because I've only been a manager for a little over a year, I would recommend focusing on that. I didn't in my own personal experience. Somebody reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, we have this job opening and you look like you've got all the experience we want." Part of the reason for that was because at Meta, I designed and implemented our safety lab. They didn't have one. And so I looked at the standards that were applicable, including laser safety and basically audio video safety, and put the lab together, designed to test all of those things, and started getting the lab. Let's say I started the work on getting the lab ready for 17025, which is it's a quality standard of sorts that is aimed at assuring that a lab has all of the metrology understanding and meeting the metrology requirements for test and measurement. Metrology was the first branch of physics in human existence, because before we could do anything else, we needed to learn to measure things and measure them consistently and progressively more accurately and with greater precision. So that's kind of where I was with that. And they wanted that experience at MeteorCom. So they asked me to come and manage the lab and effectively rebuild it. And it's completely different from safety. This is a radio lab, for all the radios that manage the positive train control system that we have in the US. Positive train control is basically a series of radios and a lot of sensors and a lot of feedback and a lot of correlation of data. And the radios broadcast in various different bands. So it's complicated and somewhat proprietary, so I can't talk too much about it, but it's almost an IT job. And I did a little bit of IT in the back, in the previous years, but it's technical beyond that. So there's some IT kinds of roles that my people have. And along with the other hats they wear, they're RF or network experts. And then there's configuration, a ton of Unix command line work and stuff like that. So it's an interesting job. It's a big switch away from my original background, although there are overlaps, of course, that made the job doable. My biggest accomplishment, I suppose, is that my team praises me as the best manager they've ever had. So I didn't expect that. This is my first time being a manager, and I thought I was terrible. So there you go.
No, but that sounds amazing. I have a couple of questions off the back of that. But the first one was, you did actually say that to become a manager, you had to think like a manager. How do you actually just think like a manager when you're quite young as well? Because a lot of people maybe be starting and they might not even know what a manager, even how they perform or anything.
So the thing is to find a mentor. You'll need a sponsor/mentor who will take the time in the professional role and offer you that time, for which you must, compensate them in some way by either becoming a manager in their group or whatever. But I mean, there's some giveaway too. If you find a mentor, they will teach you what it means to be a manager. There are tons of courses out there that you can take on management. They're quite static, unfortunately. But, I mean, that's the nature of massively open online courses and stuff that are available for free or for a small fee. Coursera is one of those that has a ton of courses on that stuff. And of course, there's Fred Pryor, whom I don't care for, but that's personal. That's the way to get there quickly. So if you focus on being a manager in your career, it means you do your best work right in front of you. The stuff that's happening right now, you do your best work. You start thinking as a manager when you think about things like, is this sustainable? Is this the best way to do it? What are the best practices for this kind of thing? Are the right people involved in the work? Are you using someone who has tremendous capability beyond their role? And if so, you want to think about promoting them, moving them out. There's a lot of little things, and a mentor will walk you through them. I didn't go that route, again, because I didn't expect to be a manager ever. I didn't even want to be a manager when I was younger. I was terrified of the concept just because you're affecting someone's career. The people you manage, you're affecting them. And how you promote them to other groups, promote in terms of, giving praise and whatever, how you make them feel on a day-to-day basis, that sort of thing, all becomes really important. And that's human skills, if you will, and not technical skills. And I have ADHD, so technical skills are right up my alley, but human skills take longer to learn when you have that brain wiring. So I definitely was not born with empathy or consideration or things like that. So I had to learn those along the way. They were not automatic. A lot of people just have empathy automatically and that sort of thing. I had to actually learn it. So that was an interesting journey.
It does, but it seems really amazing, though. You were saying that you have to, within your team, to be a good manager, you have to identify people in your team that are, can do more than they've been tasked to do. How do you actually do that?
Well,
who to promote.
Sure. You have to understand the role, and then you have to watch their performance. I've got one guy that I'm I'm going to lose two people in this year. One was toward the beginning of the year, and his skills, he had a lot of the same background I did. His skills are way beyond where the work we were doing was, it was just a very small window of his capabilities. And so I promoted him out of the group into engineering. And they were happy to have him because of his testing skills and that sort of thing. He actually has design background and testing background, and that's kind of unusual for a test engineer. So he moved into engineering as a full engineer and still does an awful lot of testing as part of it. But he authored a lot of the tests from the ground up. He designed a whole bunch of the tools that this group, the group I'm managing, uses, some of which were spreadsheet things and some of which were integration of data into official databases and things like that. Plus, he designed one of the databases. He designed the hardware test racks that we build. So just a lot of capability beyond the group's scope. And so I wanted to promote him. I've got another one who's interested in software. He wants to join a different group, and he's really aggressive with his education, and he's quite young, but he's aggressive with his education, and he wanted to become a firmware author, right? So sitting back and designing firmware and being part of a team who does that kind of thing. Firmware is software, for those people who don't know, is software that's basically embedded in the system and has a lower hardware level responsibility within a stack of operating systems. So it basically is responsible either for talking to a hardware abstraction layer, as in Windows, or talking directly to the hardware. So a lot of the code is written in C or C++, a small amount of it in assembly, simply because it's fast and you get direct access to the processor that way. There's just a lot of stuff that, that's outside of the scope of my group, but he just loves it. That's his passion. So I'm basically going to lose him, but I'm absolutely behind him on this. I want him to succeed, and I have promoted him in the sense of, getting recognition for him in other groups. Plus, his work speaks for itself. He's fast, he's efficient. He doesn't ever not respond to somebody's request. He's always on top of that kind of thing. And so those types of responsibilities tell me he can go, and his capabilities, he can go way beyond where he is. So
Yeah.
that's how.
Do you think it's for someone younger who's just starting out in their career? Do you think they need to be aggressive to progress their career quickly?
I will say that you need to be aggressive in your education and aggressive in a broad enough scope of related technologies and things like that. If you're going to do, work in any technical field, it doesn't matter whether it's energy or anything. It could be, I hate to call an architect technical, but they are. It could be anything like that. But you need to have a strong focus on your interest, and you need to be able to recognize parallel pieces of information or parallel subjects that belong to what you're after, and broaden your experience on that. I also recommend technical people often have, ADHD, or they're somewhere on the autism spectrum, those kinds of things, because those are the sorts of brain wiring that give us the strength to be extremely good at technical skills, not necessarily so good people skills and that sort of thing. So I recommend that young people, if they know they're uncomfortable around people, or if they're uncomfortable giving, a presentation to a management team or whatever, go outside of your comfort zone and get comfortable with that as best you can. The human skills are actually the most important in advancing your career. I didn't realize that when I was younger, but I do now. How you interact with people, the way you treat people, all of that sort of stuff matters. If you're generally a grumpy, doesn't want to talk to anybody, or if you're so shy and self-reserved that you can't do it, you're not going to advance as quickly. It will take somebody else recognizing your work to even start the advancement. And for me, that's how that happened for the first, well, I don't know, 30 years. Somebody else recognized what I was doing and said, hey, you'd be good at this. If you want to do it yourself, and in terms of promoting yourself with your work, not with a lot of words, you still have to have good people communication skills and recognize how to treat somebody even in an adversarial situation, right? You strongly disagree with somebody about their course of action or whatever. You have to be able to find a way that still treats them as a human being and a valuable member of a team, even though you disagree with them. So
I agree. I do agree.
that's huge. I mean, if you don't have those skills, your advancement is very slow.
Do you really think that communication is very important?
I think it's more important than the technical skills. And the reason I say that is because if you don't know how to communicate, then more than 50% of your capabilities will be invisible.
Okay. Do you really think as much as that? I didn't think
I
it
do.
would be as much as that.
Yep, that's a big one.
And that is quite surprising.
Learning to write and write well paying attention to this is my foray into saying don't skimp on your what we call bonehead classes, right? The English and those kinds of things. Get good at writing. Get good at understanding your audience. Who's going to read this and how much detail do you need? If it's upper management, they don't give a rip about the details. They only give, their attention to how does this meet the business needs and the goals that we have set for this year. That's all they care about. They don't care about the weeds at all. But you do as the person down in the weeds. So learning to write, communicate effectively with the different groups, and that means sometimes you're going into the weeds in a great detail, like writing a theory of operation or something like that, if you happen to be a designer of some kind. That's probably the hardest part of the communication chain, is figuring out your audience. And you'll make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I've made so many I lost count 30 years ago. So you just have to learn that as a primary skill. And it doesn't matter who your audience is at that point. You just have to learn to communicate at their level. And there are tiers, right, of communication. So it's not like you're learning every nuance in the universe. It's just the basic 4 or 5 audiences that you're going to have in a corporation. If you're entrepreneurial and doing your own thing, you'll figure that out. But definitely focus on being able to write and being able to communicate something to someone else in such a way that you've basically eliminated all their questions by answering them, right? Well, maybe not all, but most. If you answer the questions in the material that you're presenting by giving the answers, right? You don't have to say, common question, common answer, that kind of thing. That's not required. But just anticipate what the questions will be and cover that in the material and in a reasonably progressive way, right? So you start from an abstract and you move into, just like you're writing a lab report or something like that, except it's aimed at human communication most of the time. That's it. I definitely recommend the communication skills as better than 50% of your career if you're going to, especially if you want to move to management.
I mean, I do agree, but there is maybe the old saying that engineers can't write reports that well because they're always used to doing tests,
Yes.
testing. And is that really, do you really think that that's true? How do you really get out of that?
So engineers write in general without thinking about an audience or whatever. They write to another engineer. That's the level of writing that they're providing. We used to have, way back in the day, back in the 80s, we used to have our engineers at the biomed company write the manuals. And we would get customers who absolutely loved it. They were the 1%. The other customers didn't really care for the manuals because they had too much technical detail. I mean, even the user manual had the theory of operation, fully itemized, if you will, theory of operation, going through every stage of every circuit that had some impact on the outcome of measurement. That's not necessary in an operator's manual. You could save that stuff for the service manual or whatever. But it took time for us to actually realize that we needed to have technical writers who were responsible for turning that kind of material into an operator's manual. And they have to actually sit down with the product and sit down with you and go through what you were thinking when you did this or whatever. And then, of course, you've got, in a larger company, you've got the group that does user testing. Can the audience, the customer that you're designing this for actually use the product? So you go through a lot of that kind of thing. It's very detailed. There's just no way no way to learn to write without going through a lot of that. There are classes, right? But they're not going to, just like engineering. You take engineering level classes, you get out in the real world. If you haven't done any of the work that your subject gives you knowledge of, you're going to be an idiot for the first couple of years because the real world doesn't work like the classroom. It never does. For one thing, they don't teach troubleshooting very well. And as a technician, you are entirely aware of what it means to troubleshoot, or you better be, because you won't be a technician for very long if you can't. But you have to learn it. You don't walk into the job just knowing how to troubleshoot. We're not Jedis, even though I like to think we are, but we have the mental capacity and the brain wiring to put those things together quickly and to form understandings of things. But troubleshooting is another one of those skills that you have to learn on the fly. They don't teach it in college, at least not very well. So you get out in the real world and suddenly you're stuck with stuff that, okay, this isn't making any sense until you realize that the circuit doesn't actually work like a textbook circuit. There's losses, there's hysteresis, there's lots of things that you have to learn about. And those are the kinds of things that as you progress and become a writer, well, a writer in the sense of you're documenting the stuff you're doing for an audience, you have to learn to sift through that stuff, put that in the appropriate audience category, and then filter down to how does this meet a goal that the company has this year. And that's the kind of thing, it just takes, it takes a lot of effort, trial and failure and getting back up and starting over and that sort of thing in order to get through it. You'll speed that up with a mentor. And if you have a mentor through different roles in your career, assuming the company will do that, a good company will, they will provide mentors simply on the basis, if they don't have a formal program, they will at least let you work with a manager or a technical manager being the type of person that manages, machines and that sort of thing, but doesn't manage people. These are the people that are going to give you guidance on how to progress. I didn't want to be a manager when I was younger. I took the role simply because it was available, and I was already at the point where I was saying, maybe I could be a manager. So when the job was offered, it was the right time.
Sounds pretty good. There was an interesting comment that you made about troubleshooting, and I get asked this all the time as well. How do you troubleshoot? Is it something that you, maybe us in the older category, is it something that we can teach the younger ones, or do they have to learn for themselves?
There's both. I believe if you find a good mentor in that category, they will teach you, like, for example, in an electrical circuit, where do you start when you're troubleshooting and you can't figure out what's going on? You start with the power supply. Is the power supply doing what it's supposed to do? Then you move out from there and you move through the path that gets you to a particular area, a particular circuit that either isn't functioning at all or is functioning outside of the parameters that would be required for a fully functional product. And you find your way there. And sometimes it's more than one area, more than one circuit of a complex product that has, gone out of spec, if you will, either isn't functioning at all or is functioning in a way that's inconsistent with the product's behavior because it's been damaged or because somebody loaded the wrong components into the board, that kind of thing. So it's a start at the beginning and work through until you get to the end. But you have to understand what signals you're going to find from point to point, and whether or not they're the correct shape. For example, in AC circuits, which is the most of electronics, you have got some sort of oscillation or some sort of AC component in many things until you get to a point. But your power supply is often DC. So at some point you've gone into the signal generation. Could be because you've got a DAC in there and it's producing a signal, etc. So understanding what you need at each point you measure, what should you see there, and under what conditions, because the product may have dozens of different conditions where that signal will be different. Understanding whether or not there's unintended filtering going on, for example, like stray capacitance and that sort of thing. It just, the faster the signal gets, the more that becomes a problem. You'll have what they call parasitic capacitance, and that's an issue that you have to deal with for sure. But it's the start at the beginning and move out concept that is not taught well in college. And so you have to learn that. I learned it with a mentor, and he was the most amazing smartass I've ever met. But he was very good at what he did. Very good. And he was patient, even if he would tease me quite a bit. So that was a big deal. Had I tried to learn that stuff on my own, I could do it, but I wouldn't have been as effective, and I wouldn't have asked myself the right questions all the time. I go through thought experiments. For me, that's the way my brain works. So I'll think about what this thing is supposed to do, and I can come from the output backwards and meet myself as I'm going from the beginning through. And that isn't going to work for everybody. You have to find the techniques that work for you and become a reliable and successful technician. If you're going to move out of technician into engineering, you almost always have to move through becoming an engineering technician rather than just a bench tech. And the engineering technician is much more involved. You're helping the design team directly by providing feedback and asking questions and troubleshooting things, keeping accurate records of things you find repetitive, that kind of thing, and documenting the details in a way that you can talk to the engineer and say, hey, this isn't working the way we thought it would. Or this is working great. It's never out of spec. You also end up getting into coding because the world basically operates on software. Everything but the trees and the grass has some sort of software interface to it. Even the microwave oven, those that are an online product. I'm staring across the room at an old style, it's new, but it's an old style 80s boombox with the addition of being able to record the cassettes onto a USB stick as MP3s, which is the whole reason I bought it, because I've got all these old cassettes, and I want to get them off of there. But everything else has some sort of, processor interface and software and that sort of thing. So even a technician is going to be writing some code. And that was true even in the 80s, but it's much more true today. So if you're going to get into the technical world and you're going to do electronics especially, be sure that you take good engineering level programming classes and understand the difference between firmware and software and the interfaces between them, multiple operating systems running on the same product. If I had to advise, I would say take an operating system architecture class where you actually write some component or dissect some component of an operating system. I got into a kernel special interest group online, and my job was to write the bootloader in assembly, right, for that special interest group thing. So get involved in those kinds of things because it broadens your knowledge and it gives you insight into troubleshooting, even outside of your immediate field. The more insight you have, the faster you will adapt and grow with a role, or reach your manager level if that's what you're interested in. If you're interested in getting an extremely high degree, like a doctorate in electrical engineering, which they do offer, you're probably going to end up working at a college and teaching. But at the same time, there are plenty of PhD scientists who are in the design roles because they're doing the research. They're either inventing new technology or they are taking the technology somewhere that it's never been before, which is quite often the case. Lasers, for example, were never intended to be shined into the eye. That is absolutely foreign to a laser safety concept. It's the exact opposite of what you do in laser safety. But in many products, they shine lasers and very bright LEDs and things like that through filters, of course, into the eyes. They're scanning the retina. They're identifying where you're looking on a screen just by scanning and understanding the spatial relations between where you are, what the screen size is for the distance that you are away from it, and where your eyes are looking. So they can figure out exactly where you're looking just by using a scanning technique that is calculated to fit the grid that is on the screen, that sort of thing. It's phenomenal to me that people would shine lasers in someone's eyes on purpose, but that's how that stuff works. And of course, again, it's low power by the time it gets to the eye. So you have to learn all those things if you're going to do laser safety or laser design for that matter, because my job was also to teach the scientists and engineers where the safety was critical, what redundant safety mechanisms would be in place, because you can't have just one. If you fault a safety component or safety mechanism and it results in a hazard, you fail. You have to go back and add redundancy into that. And at Meta, they sometimes use 3 or 4 different layers of redundancy, depending on how severe it would be if the safety mechanisms failed. So it's all, again, it's a broad set of subjects, and being able to manage a technical group means that you have some understanding of what they're doing at the technical level, and you have the ability to write and communicate, and you have the people skills necessary to be sure that your people are taken care of. That, because if they're not, then the service they provide will be impacted, sometimes useless. So I guess I could sort of wrap that up in saying, go as deep as you want into the subject that you're interested in, and recognize that that might not be the subject you're interested in 10 years from now, or even 5 years. And broaden yourself as much as possible without compromising the depth in the thing that you're interested in. And that just takes time. Continuing education, mentorship, exposure to things that you're uncomfortable with and learning to do them well, especially like presenting information, PowerPoint slides. God forbid, I hate PowerPoint, but it is a tool that people recognize, and it is provides a communication format that people like. So where I work, we have to use it. I got no choice. I think it's an outdated, clunky sort of thing, but it's definitely a tool that's required where I work. So again, it's fairly broad, and you're working little things at a time. It's okay to take different jobs, get out of the industry that you're in and get into a different one. Stretch yourself. I think the discipline to stretch yourself is as important as learning to communicate well in its own way, because that is a form of communication. You're communicating with your own mind. You put yourself in a situation and you do it, and you're afraid, and sometimes you even lock up and can't speak if you're as afraid of that sort of thing as I was. But you'll get through it, and you'll recognize that that perceived danger, your mind going into fight or flight mode and that sort of thing, is actually not dangerous. And you learn over time, you get through it. I have panic attacks from time to time. The first time I had one of those, I collapsed. And that's just because the anxiety was totally out of control. So I learned that in a panic attack, you feel like you're dying, but you're not. So I had to learn to tell myself, okay, this is going to last 10, maybe 15 minutes. And in that time, tons of chemicals will be released into my system that provide me with a complete fight or flight response. But it's unreal. There is no danger. There's nothing I need to run from, etc. And they sometimes come out of the blue. I have no idea why, but you get a panic attack and it just hits you. And after it's all done, and it takes several hours to recover from those things, because you've got all the adrenaline and cortisol and everything else pumped into your system. It takes time to get that back to normal. It completely unbalances your hormone levels. In the brain, they're not called hormones; they're called neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and all that. But that's the kind of thing that you're doing when you're facing speaking in public or presenting something to the president of the company or anything like that. You're going to be typically uncomfortable with that. Put yourself in the situation anyway. Allow yourself to be that kind of communicator. If you don't, the advancement will be slower. Again, it's about the mentorship, and I've added a component here that's dealing with your fears. Put yourself in an uncomfortable situation that isn't going to result in actual catastrophe, and just go through it. And eventually, the fear will go away. It will become maybe even enjoyable. I actually like getting in front of managers and talking about things, because that's how we communicate what's working and what's not working. And as a manager myself, I recognize that as I go up the chain, what they're interested in from my information pool is different than what I might be interested in. So I have to learn to talk to that. And it's just, that's a good way to think about becoming a manager from a bench tech or somebody who starts off, I won't say low, because I still value a bench tech as much as I value myself, but fewer responsibilities and a more limited job scope. It's getting past limitations and communicating well and treating people with respect that are the bulk of growing. The information that you learn and the skills and techniques and all that are going to become more natural to a person who's basically wired to be that way. So that won't be the most difficult part of advancing.
I think so too, actually. I do. There's so many things I could ask you off the back of that. But I was going to say, do you think it is? I mean, even when I start a new job, and I've been a contractor for a while now, and every new job I ever start, you always get the fear. But then when you get there, it's never as bad as you really think. Do you think that you ever get over that? And do you think that the younger ones need to put themselves in that situation more?
You don't get over it. If you have an inherent emotional response to new situations, The only tools that you have available in that are: one, don't do it too fast. Two, recognize that you are going to be uncomfortable. And three, recognize that almost no situation is as bad as you imagine it. And for those of us who have those kinds of fears, and especially for engineers, we always imagine the absolute worst outcome. And then we back up once we get into the situation and say, oh, well, it isn't that bad. What do I need to do to make this better? And you start to be able to think, because when you're in that mode where you're afraid, you're in fight or flight response, and your thinking becomes extremely limited. It's only survival. You don't care about anything else at that point. Your brain is wired to make you safe as much as possible, to take your own life into consideration and protect you. So it is a response that is effectively based on our evolution and our development as human beings, but it's not always appropriate. And the world we've created today, we weren't evolved to fit in this. We've created it because we're, basically intelligent and capable of learning from mistakes and that sort of thing. The first couple of boom boxes, for example, that were produced were garbage. They got better. Everything's an iterative process, and that includes human growth. So no, you don't ever get over the initial fear, but you do learn how to recognize that almost every single time you will have imagined it worse than it is.
I absolutely agree. I do absolutely agree, and I've been there quite a lot of times myself, I have to say.
Sure.
More times than I care to admit, actually. I'm just thinking about I'm just thinking about your comments about the boombox. I bet every younger one is busy Googling that just now, actually.
Yeah. There are plenty of people out there who don't know what a boombox is, because we got out of that in the mid 90s, I guess. And that sort of thing started in the 80s, pretty much. And, people walking around with their very large portable cassette player or whatever. When CDs came out, those started to get fairly popular in capability as well. They added CD players to the boom boxes. But there was a thing about carrying this enormous, very loud stereo system around on your arm or on your shoulder and listening to it turned up loud. I'm probably partly deaf as a result of doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, probably me too, actually.
Yep.
Yep, probably me too. Right, I'm going to maybe ask you one final question. It's probably quite a big question, actually. You were mentioning right at the start about how you got your job, maybe your manager's job through
Right.
LinkedIn. How did you actually make yourself stand out to get that type of opportunity?
I listed my skills and I mentioned that I had been a technical manager. And I made sure that the understanding for the reader was that a technical manager manages process and detail, procedure, lab operations, because I was a lab manager, and manages all aspects of that, including making sure that the lab is functional, making sure that calibration schedules don't mean that we're unable to use a particular piece of equipment while it's out for cal. In other words, we have redundancy there. We've got another piece we can put in place. Lots of things like that. So I made sure that the details were enough there. And you can look and see that the lab manager duties are pretty well defined in shorter sentences on my profile. But details in that kind of a position matter. There's a general sentiment for job search and that sort of thing that resumes should be short, 2 or 3 pages at most. Mine is 5 pages long. And I did that on purpose because the details matter. And if a company won't hire me or won't even look at my resume when it's that long, then I'm not interested in working for them. It's that simple. if they do look at the details and they want my skills and they want me to come in and do something, even if it's outside of my identified skill set, if the hiring manager and the HR person and recruiter think that there's a fit there, they'll come and get you. You just have to put yourself out there. LinkedIn is not the only place, and maybe not even the most relevant place to have your information. There are others out there, and I recommend people just search and find what they want. Get your resume out and recognize that once recruiters get a hold of your resume, you are going to get, when you've got more experience and that sort of thing, you are going to get hammered. You'll get, 8 or 10, sometimes 12 job opportunities a day. The more you're out there, the more you're going to get. But that's not a bad thing. It's annoying sometimes to have to deal with all the texts and the emails and the recruiter that hounds you because he thinks he's got the great fit and he's going to get great pay out of getting you a job position. I leave myself out there even when I'm employed. I don't always have the open to work thing going on in LinkedIn, for example, because that's a little bit dangerous if you're in a stable position. I'm always out there. Get myself out there. Get over the fear of, oh my God, did I do that right? Did I have the right information on my resume? Write your resume based on your interests. And then that's your base resume. When you're applying for a job or a recruiter asks you to tweak the resume to fit the outstanding areas, that almost all job descriptions will have absolute requirements, pretty much requirements, nice to haves, and then the wild stuff, that they hope you might have. And you learn to write the resume such that very early on, such as a skills list or something like that, that you're covering the items they want. A lot of times, if you don't meet an education requirement, you might have experience that gives you an equivalent for what they're looking for, and they'll tell you that's the case. Some absolute requirements, like you have to be a doctorate in, radiation physics, for example, you don't get around that. You have to have a doctorate. But if you've got the experience that they're looking for, they'll say, or equivalent experience. And sometimes it's good to apply even when you don't think you could possibly qualify for the job, because they may not have received a resume for anyone that they actually wanted with every single thing they were insistent upon, but they still need to fill the role, and you might be next best, so to speak, in the resumes that they get. So it's a good idea to be open-minded about it. If you're actually the one who's submitting a resume and initiating contact with the company, the recruiters will do a ton of work if the job is a good one and they're going to get paid well to get you lined up, right? They're going to say, oh, make this tweak. They're good at it. They're good at disappearing when you when you try to contact them and they don't think you can qualify for anything they've got open at the time, I guess, for lack of better terminology. They sort of ghost you, it's that's okay. I ghost back in return. So yeah, I mean, the recognition is basically identifying what you're good at, what you're interested in, and why that mattered to the company that you work for.
It's great advice. I might squeeze one last question in, and it's probably quite an important one as well. Just one final one. I was going to say, and I have been asked to do this as well, for many years, not so much now, but for when I was much in my early career. If an agency, and you've got to love them because they're your best pals, if an agency contacts you and asks you to doctor your CV to a specific job that they are recruiting for you, should you do it?
I would say yes, because the odds of you getting a particular job, especially if you're interested, truly interested in that job, it's worth touting the skills you've got that they're interested in. So I have, 150 different copies of my resume, all tweaked. I still use resumes for the most part. I haven't gotten to the CV, although that is technically the definition of the CV is it's greater detail, right? So they can be quite long. Yeah, definitely tweak it, especially if you can maintain multiple copies of it. And I, as a resume, author, I have so many copies of them that I have them in separated directories and available on machines, whether I'm at home or out in the wild, so that I can actually get to it on my phone and send it to somebody if they request it.
And that is amazing advice. Amazing advice. Right, I'm gonna leave it there. I could have asked you a million more questions, but we're gonna leave it there. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Gary for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.